On today's episode, we talk about how people need to stop acting like sheep and send their kids right back into the sheep pen, how schools don't indoctrinate kids with social agendas, how science itself is always true and not a process of discovery of truth, and how education is a right because the court said so. This is Cringe Posts. Welcome to this episode where we take on the online takes that make you cringe. I'm Donald.
I'm Britt.
And today we have a special host with us, a guest speaker, TJ Lucassen. TJ, if you want to introduce yourself and anything that you want to go ahead and rep.
Yeah, so my name's TJ Lucassen, as was already mentioned, and I host the Joe Rogan podcast. I'm just kidding. I do have a podcast, though. My podcast is called the Holy Bold Podcast. I'm a Reformed Baptist guy and would love for everyone to come check it out. There's my shameless plug, and we can move on.
Beautiful. So since TJ was so bold in his plug there, we have to roast him instead of Britt or I. So Britt gets a bye this week. He gets to escape.
Nice.
But we will come back to him. And this week we get to see this absolute gem from TJ. And TJ, if you want to give any background on this, we'd love to hear it because I'm enamored.
Yeah, I think it deserves some explanation. So, this was, I think it was the summer after my senior year of college, but I did 5 years of college. So this was between my second to last and last year of college. And I was enamored with women before I got married. And so essentially at this point in my life, Facebook solely existed for me to try to get the attention of girls. And oddly enough, this is one of the ways I tried to do it. And so...
Is that a katana?
That's a katana, one of a set of two. You're just lucky the other one's not on screen. And a Viking helmet. Those things don't go together. And for me... The funniest thing about this photo is the background, because this is my room that I grew up in, throughout high school. And that's the thing, is this is my high school room, not like my childhood room. If you look at the back, you'll notice the walls are painted like castle bricks. And on that shelf behind me, you can see figurines of wizards and dragons. So that is the room that I lived in all the way through high school and every college summer. That's who I am. So that's about the worst thing that I can imagine. And there it is. If that doesn't make you cringe, I don't know what will.
I appreciate the photo editing of it, where you've got all black and then just the gold is emphasized. Is very early 2000s.
Well, thanks to Donald Kimball and David Kimball. I was a big Windows Phone guy, and at the time at least, and Windows Phone had some fantastic photo editing capabilities, and so. Brought to you by the defunct Windows Phone.
Man, you can't besmirch Windows Phone like that. Don't drag it down here. I still like Windows Phone.
Do they exist still?
No, but I still I fondly remember it. I don't need to drag it down anymore, man. No, I love this because I think the fact that this is how you I have to ask. Did it work? Were you getting
you got married
of women in your DMs? Yeah.
I can tell you there was no action from this photo. No, it did not help me at all. And I think I was especially desperate at this point because this was about 3 weeks before I got knee surgery and was going to be out of commission for, months on end. And so I was like, if I can't get a girl to talk to me now, like it's not going to happen in 3 weeks. So that was my fallen, stupid mindset in college. And praise the Lord, he has sanctified me since then. But that's
do you still have those action figurines behind you, or did your wife let you keep them?
They are proudly displayed on our mantelpiece.
Beautiful. Oh no.
I have no idea where those are now, which is a good thing.
I'm gonna talk to your wife and make sure that this photo is like in your house, printed somewhere, as a reminder that you can die to yourself and become anew. So moving on. I think we roasted TJ quite enough there. We'll move on to roasting other people. We'll start with this post here. This policy shutting down schools is dumb, and the science proves it. open up the schools back to normal and stop acting like frickin' sheep. And this is a take from a more conservative Republican, but why we picked this one, and I love, is they're like, man, shutting down the schools is terrible. Don't be a sheep. Put the kids right back in the schools. And you're like, oh my gosh. Like,
that might be the only good thing about the COVID shutdowns is that kids weren't in public school anymore.
Yeah. You know where sheep are bred?
Yeah.
Public schools.
Exactly.
Public schools.
Exactly. It's like, and the funny thing is too, is this is such a milquetoast Republican talking point that was made by a lot of state legislators, where it's, the line is, schools are being shut down by the government, open them back up. And that's what you're supposed to repeat. So not only is just like the idea of sending your kids back into the public school to become sheep, just like repeating the line like a frickin' sheep. It's like you're not using any critical analysis to be like, well, you know, I could even say this policy of shutting down schools is dumb. We should be directing school funding education back to parents. Like, that would be a more nuanced take. That would be, you know, like, at least using your head. But instead, they're like, open them back in and kick them back in. It's like if they shut down prisons. They're like, oh, man. And then, you know, druggies are out on the streets. Put them back in. And, you know, like, put all the nonviolent offenders back in. And, like, Britt and I cringing. Like, no, that's not the point. Like, if you didn't do anything wrong. So, I don't know. It just, it cracked me up. Because, like, the stop acting like frickin' sheep was just too good to pass up, I think.
Yeah, for me, it's like you as soon as you bring in the word sheep, like, you just guarantee that there's not going to be any thoughtful dialogue. You know, like, when you start calling people sheep, because the accusation there is like, none of you are thinking about it. Like, there's no critical thinking on your side of the spectrum. You're just a bunch of sheep. So it's like those people are just going to immediately disregard anything you have to say when you speak to them like that.
I like what you said. It's like, stop acting like freaking sheep and get back in the sheep pen. You know, like,
yeah. Well, it makes me think of the way you put it there, TJ. It makes me think of when someone puts on their resume, like, very detail oriented. All you've done is set yourself up to fail, because it's like, if there's one thing wrong on your resume, if there's one comma out of place, you're like, detail oriented. I don't know about that. You know, and just like, stop acting like freaking sheep, and you're like, oh, I don't know about that, man. You might want to check yourself first there.
Yeah. Oh man, just absurd. I have no respect for me. It's like, always when you're gonna engage in a dialogue with somebody else, just talk about the actual points.
Right.
Like, don't assault the character, because it shuts down dialogue immediately, and it just guarantees that there will not be any fruitful, you know, moving forward in discussion.
Right. Exactly right. Well, unless there's any other comments, we'll move on to our second quick cringe here, which is, okay, so this, I'll give a little bit of context to this one as well, because it was a comment found on a PragerU YouTube video. So I'll read the comment and then I'll give some context. So PragerU saying school should be apolitical would mean we shouldn't teach kids about the Holocaust. They are basically saying school isn't about educating our students about the society they live in, or the repercussions that their actions and the actions of others have. It's just about teaching them to write and do basic math. No way. I hope anyone who agrees with this becomes a kindergarten teacher, because I would not want my teenage child in the hands of a person who believes doing nothing against clear injustice or not speaking about recent events is a good thing. And the argument that the PragerU video was making was that public schools have become too politicized and too social justice active-y, and not doing enough to teach basic skills that should be getting taught. And I don't 100% personally agree with all of the PragerU video's points, but I crack up at this comment because they essentially, they make the argument that PragerU does, they boil it down in the wrong way, saying that, like, if you overly politicize something, you can't talk about it at all. And it shows this person's binary way of thinking that if something happens in history and you don't overly politicize it, you're just not talking about it right. Clear injustices, for instance. And this person is not leaving room for the idea that you should depoliticize schools, but bring up discussion, let people talk, let people engage, let ideas clash, talk about recent events, but also you need to get back to teaching the basic skills that kids need to operate in the world. It's a balancing act, and this person seems to completely miss that point and, like, think, oh, if we don't want overly political schools, then you can't talk about the Holocaust then. Checkmate.
Yeah, it's what's funny about these kind of people is they they assume that the reality they perceive is like the reality for everyone. It's kind of like, what do you mean you don't want people to have free healthcare? Like, you must be the devil then, right? It's like, well, what do you mean? Like, we're supposed to teach our kids about society, and that means teaching them this specific brand, of SJW activism. It's like there's no other way to teach people about society. There's not two ways to think about it, or multiple ways to think about it. There's just the one, index card of allowable opinion to actually, that they want to talk about, and it's unthinkable that anyone would go off script from it.
Yeah. Well, I think like what's insane to me is it directly equates politics and morality. It's like you cannot address this the assumption here is essentially like, look, the Holocaust, there is one political side of the spectrum that is a huge fan of it, and the other side is totally against it, and therefore to bring it into schools is a political thing.
Yeah.
It's like, no, like everyone all across the political spectrum agrees the Holocaust was wicked evil. Yeah. Like, even if you're somebody who rejects morality, people are like, yeah, the Holocaust was bad. So it's just this absurd like equation that they make between politics and morality, and that's just not, no one actually thinks that way in their real life. But when you get into your ideology, and start spewing it at other people, you're like, this is the way it is, like Britt was saying. It's like, no, that's not the way it is, and we don't all have to submit to your version of reality.
Well, and the creepy thing to me about it is you understand how this person doesn't want to own the responsibility of teaching these moral things to their kid and owning that. They want the school to take over that role, because I would not want my teenage child in the hands of a person who believes doing nothing against clear injustice or not speaking is a good thing. And it's like, well, how about... It was, I think all of us would agree that if you put your kids in the public education system, your kid is going to be in the hands of someone who you do not agree with. If you put your kids in a private school system, they're probably going to be in the hands of someone who on some things you do not agree with. And that's fine. The point is you need to be teaching your kids, and you need to be responsible for their moral outlook there. And so, it's just one of those things where I don't want them to be in there, and it's because that's their job, is that the school needs to teach their kid to speak out against clear injustice. And no, that's actually not the school's job. The school's job is to maybe provide the historical context and to teach them the skills to break down things and become that. Because ideally, your kid is going to be able to take the information and the skills taught and then use them to critically piece together and then act against injustice, if that's your end result of what you want out of the school, I guess.
I appreciate how this person, it's very obvious that they don't actually see themselves as having a role in developing their child, because this, awful person that doesn't teach about social injustice, they would rather them teach, their kids in kindergarten in their most formative years, than when they're a teenager. And it's like, you must not be a parent, or you must not be thinking through it. Cause it's like, if you're going to indoctrinate your kid in anything, you do it when they're formative. That's the most important time for them to solve their foundation that they've got for the rest of their lives. When they're a teenager, they naturally are going to be rebelling against whatever they are taught, right? So it's like, I don't know, this person just obviously hasn't really thought through it, and they've abdicated the responsibility of raising their children, yet they want the state to enforce it on everyone else's kids as well.
Yeah, I think it makes sense in a society where the most prominent activist organization, BLM, is, actively degrading or demeaning the idea of the nuclear family.
Right.
It's like we as a society are more and more rejecting the idea of your family, the group into which you were born matters, and parenthood matters, motherhood, fatherhood matter, and you have a responsibility to your children to raise them up in a particular way, to teach them certain things. But that's becoming not just implicitly denied at this point, but consciously. We're no, we don't want that. We want the government to do it for us. That's the government's job, is to raise my kids, and even to pay for the raising of my kids, in a million other ways. But
yeah, well, yeah. And when you look and think about this too, even the most generous interpretation of what this person is speaking out against, you start realizing that it's not a slippery slope argument to say things like they're not teaching basic math and writing. Those are basic skills that a school should teach, I think, regardless of what your opinion on activism, morality teaching. Your kids should go to school and should be able to learn how to read and do math. That is kind of to me, a non-controversial take. But now, activist groups are literally saying things like math is racist because of the white framework from which it is being offered. So, yeah, like, I think there is a pretty easy connection to say that schools are being overly politicized and not teaching basic social skills, or not social skills, just basic functioning skills. So this person is kind of, I think, burying their head in the sand a little bit about these kind of creeps in terms of what the ways that the schools are being manipulated by activist groups and organizations. So,
agreed.
All right, and we'll move on to our third and final quick cringe. From a blue check mark, so we do not keep them anonymous. Our favorite black science man, as the internet is prone to call him, Neil deGrasse Tyson tweets, "The good thing about science, capitalized, science, is that it's true, whether or not you believe in it."
He forgot to add the TM.
Yikes.
Yeah, right. Yeah, the approved science, or the the narrative. Yeah, the narrative that we get this week, science. Yeah, I don't think that's exactly how the scientific method works, but I could be mistaken there. Does anyone familiar with it, or is that also part of the white construct? I don't know.
Well, yeah, I mean, the science, clearly, what we understand about it is that it is a set of irrefutable dogmas that everyone has to hold to. And if you don't agree with the science, TM, then you are a conspiracy theorist and should be put in a gulag. And so that is, where we're at currently.
I mean, this one seems so obvious to me. It's kind of, I feel like I'm condescending any listeners right now by explaining why it's cringe, right? Like, we all know that science is a process of discovering truths about the universe, and when you get more context and learn new things, your perception of that reality can change. And so the whole thing about science is that it's true. Well, yeah, there are irrefutable facts that are true whether or not you believe in them, but science itself is the process of uncovering those things and piecing them together, and so we don't always know. And nothing has made this more illuminated than in the news recently. The theory that COVID-19 has come from a man-made lab in China is more and more looking plausible. Whereas 3 months ago, if you said that on Twitter or Facebook and just said that it was a possibility, not even said that it was true, you were banned. But guess what, Twitter or Facebook? The thing about science is that it's true, whether or not you believe in it. And now that the narrative's changing, of course, it's okay for Fauci to say that it is possible that it came from a lab. It's okay for CNN to make articles. It was not okay a couple. So this guy is not very consistent. I don't think he's very good about defending people who speak unpopular potential truths. And so that's what's just ironic about this, is he uses this almost as a way to crush these like small opinions of people who are like, I don't think that the vaccine is worth the risk, or I don't know that, COVID-19 developed naturally. He uses this as a foot to stomp out those opinions, when really you should be using this fact to promote those things.
It reminds me of, Bill Nye, the science guy, quote unquote. I think, Donna, you and I talked about it. He had that segment when he was actually filming the show where he was like, oh yeah, like this is the difference between boys and girls. They have this chromosome and that. And then you see his Netflix special with the creepy, weird ice cream where it's like, oh, everyone can be any sort of flavor, and biological sex and gender does not exist. Like it's fluid. It's on a spectrum. And it's like, man, the guy's not even a scientist, right? He's got a master's in mechanical engineering, which is still awesome, right? Like, that's cool, but you're not a scientist. And what's funny about these types of people is, like, they almost use this weird appeal to authority, right? It's like, well, if I say it with this level of snarkiness and this, level of certainty, and because I'm, on whatever Discovery Channel, like, I am the authority on this, despite not having any good arguments to back it up or any credentials or anything, other than being a TV talk show host, to back it up. And that's what's so cringe about it, right? It's like, man, like they're almost like trying to say like, oh, well, your religious leaders or any of these other people, they don't have any leg to stand on. But it's like, I don't know, you kind of don't either, and your arguments are terrible. So
well, just to supplement your point about the Netflix special, they went back and removed the episode.
Where no way.
Yeah, and from the original show, that episode was removed. They might have reinstated
like 1984
it with
stuff.
I don't know if they put it back or not. They may have, because there was a big outcry, and oftentimes they backpedal. But as far as I know, they haven't put that from the original show back. And And then, and he specifically says in that ice cream episode, I'll call it, that gender is a spectrum. Or excuse me, sex is a spectrum, not gender.
Yes. Oh.
So the gender being a spectrum is, I think, like, okay, yeah, that's kind of true to a point, right? Like, you can have tomboys as girls, and then no one would say, like, yeah, gender's a spectrum in a sense, and I think people take that to ridiculous extremes, but that's fine, whatever. Saying sex is a spectrum, that's where you cross over into the science part being pretty, at least from what we know now, biologically incorrect in most every case.
Yeah, it's just funny to me because, you know, it's the Neil deGrasse Tyson sort of person who, you know, would accuse Christians of being inconsistent, you know, and not faithful to what we believe. And the clear thing here is that he has deified science, like capital S science. It's his deity. But the whole, you know, and I don't know how much you guys like throwing around group denominations, but like the left, I will say, generally, you know, is all about the science in some instances, and then you bring up sex or gender, and they're like, no, not the science. And it's just like the nominal Christians who are like, yeah, I'm all about Jesus, until, you know, then this topic comes up, and I'm like, oh, well, not so much. I don't believe the Bible on that point. And it's like exactly the same thing, but with science traded out as the deity. It's like, oh, I believe the science until it's uncomfortable. And then, so it's like on both sides, people are just as inconsistent and just as self-motivated as like, I am going to agree with this as long as it rewards me in the ways that I want, and then when it doesn't, I'll reject it.
So, I mean, if nothing else, Neil deGrasse Tyson, you're bringing everyone together. We're all hypocrites. So thank you for that, based black science man. Okay, and we'll move on to our long-form cringe. Now this, we originally weren't sure if we were going to have TJ on, so it's actually censored, but person one is in fact TJ. So I'm outing you here. You're not a blue check mark, so we kept you anonymous at first here, but this was from a Facebook post that there was a big thread there, but we just wanted to highlight this particular interaction right here. So TJ asks, why does the government need to be in education? And this person responds, well, for one, because public education is a right, and some communities may have more money than other schools. Government involvement with the money that the government has can help ensure schools are funded adequately. Government plays a key role in government education, and I definitely think that shouldn't go away ever. And TJ replies, what makes you say that education is a right? Person 2 replies, it is a right! You're really going to argue that? Even the courts have said a public education is a right. So instead of going in and taking this part, I want to hear your thoughts, TJ, specifically if there's any insight you have just from being firsthand on the scene. Now, I will say Britt and I were witnessing this firsthand too. we were at ground zero, but I want to hear from your perspective.
Well, and I was very grateful for your later contribution about Korematsu and just that whole, like, that was a fantastic, because I don't know all those like specific things. I just know government doesn't get to tell me what my rights are. You know, that's not their role, or courts. But this post came from, or this is part of a thread on a post that I had made saying that property taxes are tyranny. And so this is someone's argument. Essentially, they had stated that, we need property taxes because we need to fund public education. And so my just response was, well, okay, why does the government need to be in education at all? Like, why can't that be a completely private thing is essentially the question I'm asking, because I grew up, I won't reveal a name or anything, but this is a guy I grew up with, and we knew each other vaguely, so I was comfortable, kind of pressing him and asking, like, hey, like, what makes you think the way that you're thinking right now? And so that's kind of where it all flowed from. And I have a list of problems with the things that he says here, but I'll let you. I don't want to steal the thunder. So if you guys have anything you want to start with, I'll let you do that.
Well, before I let Britt jump in, I'll just explain the one comment I had made was kind of a snarky one, and the post got deleted pretty much immediately after. So I felt kind of bad, like I might have nuked it. But I did say laughs in Korematsu, which of course is the decision that the Supreme Court ruled that FDR had the constitutional right to intern the Japanese citizens during World War II. And of course, that internment was a horrible human rights violation, a horrible abuse of power. And the courts didn't say it was good or moral. The courts upheld that there was a right to that. So just the same as I see TJ's line of questioning here, it's very Socratic, right? You're not making a stance one way or the other. You're just asking the question, why does it need to be an education, and why do you say it's a right? You're not taking a moral stance on it either way. And he says that the courts, have secured that right, which is hilarious because it's like, well, okay, by that justification, then the internment of the Japanese was also just as much a right and should just as valued. But anyway, I don't know if Britt, if you want to go, because I also have talked a little bit here, but go for it.
It's a really funny, the first person to comment is funny because he says government plays a key role in government education. It's like, I mean, what else, right? Like, but there's something funny about people who believe that anything done through the government is more efficient or cheaper or less expensive or better at distributing, resources and funds where they're supposed to go. I had a friend recently who told me, he's like, well, everything the government does is cheaper. Like, take, for example, the post office. I'm like, dude, the post office loses money every year. So, yeah. and the way they supplement it is they take money from us, that we might not have spent with them anyways. And they use that to, supplement and all that stuff. And when you look at, ever since the Department of Education was instituted, right, they've had declining standards according to their own standards. And then you've had the amount of administration, per student, I think it's like doubled, right, or even tripled. And that's why education costs are 300% more expensive per student than they ever have been. And that's accounting for inflation, right? So literally we're paying 3 times more per student for education and getting less and less results. And the only thing that, the only massive thing that's changed has been that there's been a Department of Education involved and the federal government has been involved in it. So it's like, I don't know, like correlation doesn't always equal causation, but I think that's a pretty big sign that whenever you get the government involved, it's going to do, it's going to waste resources. I think, you think about like Social Security, 70% of the dollars that we pay into it, you pay out of your paycheck every single time, every week. 70% of that is going to bureaucrats and middle management that's just figuring out where to place it, right? So it literally what's happening is 70% of your dollar that you put in is being destroyed. And government just can't allocate resources properly. It's crazy to me that the same people who manage and run the DOL that I hate going down to get my license renewed every year are the same people that are trying to educate our children or handling our healthcare or handling anything important. They just can't do it well. And so, if education is a right, there's no way in hell that I would want the government to handle it. So I don't believe it's a right. I believe it's, but if it was anything important, it shouldn't be handled by them.
Well, the thing about the Department of Education, Britt, is that the Department of Education is key in the involvement of the Department of Education. So you absolutely have to have the government. And the funny thing is, there isn't. He talks about an imbalance in communities having more money than others, and that's why the government needs to be involved. But when you look at our current system, the schools that do the best in underfunded areas right now are charter schools and private schools. So when students who are from poorer backgrounds are able to go to private schools through a scholarship system, or they're able to go to a charter school that's been formed by the community around them, that is getting some public education dollars, although like in Washington State, they get drastically fewer dollars per student than the public schools do, even though they're supposed to be equitably funded. The same students and the same, you hold all of the factors in terms of race, of income level, all those opportunity, all those kinds of things, and they outperform them substantially. So it's, this person, it doesn't, a lot of people tend to think that money equals solving the problem, and that's why the government needs to be involved in education, is because otherwise who's going to fund it? But when you look at the actual infrastructure of where the dollars go and how they get distributed and all that, throwing more money at the problem doesn't even fix it. It's very much a cultural issue in many respects. I'm curious your thoughts, TJ. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, he gives that line that you just talked about. Public education is a right, and some communities have more money than other schools. Mm-hmm. And then the solution that he gives is government involvement with the money that the government has.
Yeah,
the government has no money.
Yeah,
the government has my money. The government has your money. So it's just this idea that I think only the most misinformed person can possibly have, that the government, is the producer of wealth, the producer of capital, and then that it's this weird kind of inverse false version of trickle down economics where it's like the government's up here, they make the money, then it trickles down to us lowly people. Like, no, it's the exact opposite of that. It's we create capital, we create wealth, and then the government steals it from us at a gunpoint and then uses it to pay for things that we, for the most part, many of us would say, no, I'm good without that. Thank you very much. And so it's just funny that is the solution that he says, like, well, the government has all this money and they can use their socialism to make sure that all the schools are funded adequately and equally. And it's just like, hey, that's still not what's happening. Even in our current system, schools are not being funded, like, according to someone like this particular guy and many other people like him, I think they would say, no, there are still underfunded schools. It's like, okay, so you're admitting that the government isn't successfully like doing what you're saying they're doing. So it's absurd, just absurd.
So the other funny thing that sticks out to me is just the sort of posture he takes in the last line, where I think, being of a mind where all three of us are either religiously, politically, just in our general ways of thinking about the world, our epistemologies, oftentimes we're in a minority. And this makes it so that when something that we would hold as a basic assumption is challenged, we have a response and we're kind of ready for that. When I was a kid, for instance, maybe some of these things I hadn't heard challenged before, I would be taken aback and I'd be like, what? What do you mean you don't believe this thing? But it is really telling to me that, as far as I'm aware, this person that you were arguing with was not like 14 years old. And so when you ask, like, what makes you say education's a right, the fact that they can't even contend with that and not say, like, oh, that's a silly argument, here's why it's a right. They're like, you're really gonna argue that? it is a right. Like, that's okay, but why? You haven't explained anything. All he says is the courts, which I think we've demonstrated is a terrible judgment. I mean, like, Dred Scott decision, hello? Like, that one is one that's even taught in schools. Korematsu is not taught in schools very well. Dred Scott is, because they love to use it as an example of white people being terrible, which is true, but is the government being terrible too. So, it's the courts saying that a slave owner had the right to his slave. So the courts argued that. So would you say that between the time that before the courts had overruled that owning slaves was a right, and only until the courts ruled otherwise it was not? Or does there have to be something fundamentally different about a human right than just the courts upholding it? And so you ask this question, and they can't even contend with it. They can't even grasp that someone would treat that as not a given. In the same way that, I could ask Britt, well, what makes you say gravity is in effect? And Britt's like, what do you mean? Like, but even then, Britt could show me. He could say, here, I'll give you an example, and drop something, right? This person can't even do that because they're so ill-equipped, and it's not even a matter of that I think that the person's stupid. I just think that the education system, in many ways, and culture at large, doesn't prepare people to hear multiple viewpoints and opposing views.
Yeah, what I think is interesting as well is that, like, even if we concede the point, which I would not, but even if we concede the point that education is a right, that does not then mean that the government must provide it. That simply means the government should not restrict you from accessing it, but that doesn't mean that the government must actively ensure that every person has it. And so, like, even if I went along with him and said, yeah, sure, it's a right, now tell me, why does that mean the government needs to provide it? I don't think he would have an answer to that either. But the equation of kind of it's a right then makes it something that the government must give you, that's a folly.
The thing about the thing that's really horrifying about, like, things like the income tax or the property tax is that they come out of your mortgage and they come out of your paycheck, before you even receive, any benefits from it. And so you don't really feel it, right? People don't feel that money being taken away from them. And if they did, they'd be more likely to say, oh, like, this amount of service or this level of, education is terrible, like, for what we're paying for. And what made me think of that is back when I was being homeschooled, there was a school district in my hometown that basically they said, hey, homeschoolers, you register with our school district and we'll give you, 80% of the funding that we receive, from the state so that you can use it for like field trips or music lessons or buying books or whatever. And at the time, the school district was receiving about, I think it was like $11,000 or $12,000 per student per year to fund, education. And people don't realize like that's a lot of money, and you can do a lot of stuff with that. And so my parents would receive that money for us to use towards education expenses, and we could do so many cool things. I had fantastic music teachers. We got to go on different field trips all over the country with it. We were able to pay for these classes. Like there's a homeschool co-op, and these college level, university level professors that had kids that they wanted to teach were teaching these classes. So I literally had like literature classes and science classes with university level professors that were able to use that for. It's like, and we, at the end of it, we had to give money back to the school district because we didn't even use all of it, right? And that's kind of what's so awesome about when you give people their money back and you say, hey, spend it where, it's going to be most efficiently used. The market comes and it makes it so that that capital is allocated properly and the best outcome, results. It's like, man, like literally for half of what they were spending on per student at the public school level, we were able to get, infinitely better education just from, the gall of having my parents, normal people, decide, where money should be allocated. This person would find that horrifying, and that's kind of the argument they make. It's like, well, parents aren't going to be able to make those decisions. It's like, any parent that cares enough to make sure their kid goes to public school is going to have the ability to figure out, to know what is good education and what's not when they're handed a check or not even having their money taken away from them, right? That's $10,000 taken away from each of us each year that we could be using for other things.
Yeah, the funny thing is I think a lot of people would argue that parents maybe aren't always the most well-intentioned for their kids and aren't going to be that proactive. But my mind kind of thinks that, well, those are the kinds of parents also who kind of just want to pass their kids off away. And if they can get the money back that they're being robbed of from the public school system, pay less of that and still send their kid to like a co-op or a private school or something like that, where, and of course, when you remove public education from being the monopoly, private education costs for everything are going to go way down, right? Because you don't have to compete with a free thing. But you give them their money back. They don't have to spend all of that. And the parents that don't care will still say, okay, well, I want to get my kid out of the house. Like, I don't want them bothering me, or I want them taken care of. And they'll still pay. And then the kid, they get to keep more of their money. The kid goes and gets a better quality education, most likely, than they're getting currently. And again, the problem there to me is like, it's not that the public education system is even going to rescue that kid whose parents don't care. That's another false equivalency that's often made is, well, what about the kids who get left behind because their parents aren't there for them? Those kids are still getting left behind, and the public education system, in many cases, is actively making that worse for them. Because my favorite quote from Michael Malice is that the public education system is, for many, if not most people, the only place in their lives where they will experience physical violence. And you think about that and you're like, okay, so the kid whose parents don't care about him are going to this government-run school, and they're saying, look, without this government-run school, they would be left in the lurch, and they're getting either involved in gang violence, getting involved in bad drug circles, or they're getting beaten up by those who are doing those things. And so a lot of the time, people like this think the government has a key role. They have to get involved. They have to play it. And when you flip, they try to flip the script and say, if you take the government out, all these problems occur. And you look at the status quo and you think, are they being helped right now? I certainly don't think they are.
Is this the better version?
yeah. Like, I'm willing to take that risk. And I don't think any of us, if we had our ideal forms of government or non-government, think that it would be a perfect society. There are always going to be problems and things you have to contend with and deal with. And that's true of education or not. But I think when you look at examples in African countries where they are in global poverty, I wish I could remember the country. It's a Tom Woods interview, and in one of his books, he talks about this with a guy. So I'll try to find that if I can provide that. But he talks about how there are countries where there is a public education system created for free, and yet the communities come together, and it's something like 40 to 60% still opt to do like public like communities, or
Wow.
excuse me, not public school, but like private or like charter type things, even though they have free education and they are impoverished. There are impoverished nations whose GDP is so vastly lower than the US that our poor areas look rich compared to that country. And they are able to band together and do that when there's community. So a lot of the education system to me seems like it's it's more of a community thing, and why public charter schools do well is because the community gets together with people who care and with people who want to address those needs and tackle them head on. One other quick thing I will add is that a lot of the times people think, like, well, what about the kids in impoverished areas? If you eliminate all government schools, what happens to them? And I'm like, well, do you think that there are people who care about those kids right now? And if you eliminate government schools, do you think they go away? Do you think that they just stop caring about the kids? The government's not around, I can't do anything. It's like, no, the government schools are around, and we still have people who are begging to create charter schools, and the Washington State Charter is limiting how many charter schools are allowed to be made. We're capped, and there are applications to make more, and they wouldn't expand the cap. So no, I don't think if you eliminate government schools, the people who care about the people in rough neighborhoods goes away. In fact, I think you free them to be able to create more small systems that can address the needs more locally.
Yeah, this will be the last thing I say, unless there's something else you want to talk about specifically. But for me, I think just like the most unsettling part of this whole exchange and people with this mindset, and we kind of talked about this a little bit up with the first Cringe post that we looked at, but it's just this idea. I think they're placing God or government as their God. It's this all-knowing, all-capable being that is meant to meet every single need that a person has. And so if that's education, if that's healthcare, whatever it might be, the government is responsible for making sure that I, as the individual, have these things. And I just think that a society cannot subsist for very long with a populace that gives that sort of power to its government. And I think all of us are very small government, maybe varying amounts of exactly how small we think the government should be. But because we understand that when you give any organization that much power, it cannot go well. It's just not possible. And so I think, that's the most unsettling thing to me, is just this this inclination to just hand over every important part of life to somebody else and say, I need you to run this for me. That is grim, in my opinion.
For sure. It makes me think of a meme I saw where it's like a chia pet and it's like small government, and then it's just like it won't stop growing, and it's just like getting bigger and bigger. And yeah, I agree. Well, and to a point you brought up earlier about the sort of the positive and negative rights, where just because something is a right, which we don't see that ground, but if it is, doesn't mean the government has to provide it. I do wait for this person on your comments to come out in full support of government mandated gun classes and trainings and provisions, because the courts right now have ruled that that's a right. Even the courts say so. So I hope the government provides that for me.
Start training us up.
Yeah. Do you have any closing thoughts, Britt, or are we good to wrap it up?
I think we're good to wrap.
I think we're good. All right. Well, thank you for tuning in to this episode. TJ, if you want to plug one last time, thank you for joining us tonight. We appreciated you being here.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Again, my podcast is the Holy Bold Podcast. You can find me on basically any podcast platform and on YouTube. So there it is.
I will look for it on my Windows Phone podcast provider and hopefully find that photo of you there too. So.
Yes.
Make sure to check us out on our socials, Cringe Posts Pod on most socials there. And if anything we said made you cringe tonight, let us know there. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next one.
See ya.